As we continue to set the stage for the First Crusade, I think that it's important to look at all of the major players and where they were at the time. And one of the major players in this, the sort of third party, if you will, was the Byzantine Empire. Now, in previous videos, we've gone through Byzantine history up until the year 843 when the iconoclast controversy finally ended. So now, let's briefly take Byzantine history from 843 all the way until 1095, the year when the First Crusade was called by Pope Urban II. One of the immediate results of the end of the iconoclast controversy was that the Byzantine Church was freed up to focus on other things, especially missionary work, and this would bring them to the various Slavic peoples of Europe. From the mid-9th century on, the Byzantine missionaries would go and try to convert neighboring powers, and the hope was that by converting these neighboring powers, they were creating allies and friends for the future and extending their sphere of influence. To some extent, this was successful. Now, this is also the same period during the 9th century when the Slavs are first starting to really form states. So if you can convert a Slavic king to Christianity, that could mean that the king can then go on to convert his people, a la what Constantine did when he converted to Christianity and then started to spread Christianity among the upper classes of Roman society. One of the major obstacles that the Byzantines faced when trying to convert their neighbors was that there was a language barrier. And the two major figures in breaking that barrier between the Byzantines and the Slavs were the brothers Constantine the philosopher and Methodius from the area of Thessalonica, which was a Byzantine city surrounded by lots and lots of Slavic settlers. So they probably grew up around that population and knew quite a bit of their language, and then they worked together to really systematize the Slavic language as a written system. Now, Constantine actually did have previous experience as a missionary. He went to the Khazars and presented his case for Christianity. However, the Jewish representative actually ended up winning, and the Khazars became Jewish. The Khazars are a people in southern Russia, one of the many powers which flourished there over the many, many centuries of change and the history of that region. Now, these two brothers used the Greek alphabet as a basis from which to develop the Slavonic alphabet, and they developed what is known as glagolitic text, and that was sufficiently accurate to enable them to translate the Bible and a lot of key church text into Slavonic. Now, later on, this will get another update, and the current version of glagolitic script is now called Cyrillic, and the reason it's called Cyrillic is because Constantine was later called Cyril for some reason, I assume because of a translation issue at some point, and therefore the current Slavic alphabet is known as Cyrillic script, and it still has a vague resemblance to Greek. Perhaps the most important in the short term of all of these conversions was when Basil II succeeded in converting his friend and ally Vladimir the Great of Kiev to Christianity. Vladimir was instrumental in helping Basil II defeat his foes, the men who were challenging for him for the throne. And afterwards, when he was fighting the Bulgars and fighting in the east, Basil II relied heavily on units of Varangians who were recruited via Russia. So many of the great victories of Basil II were enabled by this event and his consequent friendship with the early Russians. So now let's get back to the maps and chaps section of this lecture. What's going on in the Byzantine world? Well, Theodora had ended iconoclasm in 843, which was also the first or second year of her young son Michael III being in power. By the year 855, he'd come of age, and he decided to assert himself against his mother, so she was put in a monastery, and he was able to rule in his own name with the help of his uncles. Now, he ends up getting blasted by Macedonian dynasty historians. Right after Michael, a new dynasty will come to power, and we'll see why he was blasted in those sources. He was accused of being pleasure-seeking and drunk, but we know that that was not necessarily all of his reputation, since we know that he was popular among poets and in Arab sources, and that he had a strong backing among the military rank and file and generals. He managed to push the Byzantine frontiers in Asia Minor to the east, so that was good, and he also appointed a patriarch named Photius, who was able to alienate the Zealot faction enough that this led to a power play by the Pope, and it led to a temporary schism. But what's really interesting about Michael is how he fell from power. We'll talk about that in just a second. Byzantium had a number of really interesting and outright bizarre emperors, from Basiliscus to Justinian II, but Basil I the Macedonian is fairly hard to beat. He ruled from 867 to 886, and he is the founder of the Macedonian dynasty. He was originally from either Thrace or Macedonia, so he was sort of a rural subject, and then he went to the capital to seek a fame and fortune. He was a man of great size and strength, so he became a wrestler, and he gained the attention of the Emperor Michael by defeating some Bulgarian champions. Michael apparently was a wrestling enthusiast, in addition to being a connoisseur of alcohol. Now, he became so close with Michael that Michael allowed him to marry his own former mistress, a girl he had been with when he was a teenager. Eventually, Michael had to get rid of that girl to marry the current empress, but, he apparently was still close with this woman, and apparently that closeness would lead to some weirdness when Basil had children, because some people suspected that the product of that union, who I think was Leo the Wise, was actually the child of Michael. But at any rate, that difficulty was eventually, something that they were able to get through. Now, Basil has a very interesting path to power. So, in 865, he was in some sort of a duel or a fight that I don't really understand with the Caesar Bardas, who was the heir to Michael's throne, and he managed to kill that guy with his own hand. Apparently this was pleasing to Michael in one way or another, so he actually named Basil to be the new Caesar the next year in 866. But then Basil decided that it was time to promote himself again, so he murdered Michael in 867 and took power. Now, obviously this created some issues, and later historians, especially historians from Basil's own house, including Constantine VII, one of the most famous emperor scholars, decided to really rewrite Basil's life story to make it less embarrassing. But, the fact is he got his start as a wrestler. So basically he was the Hulk Hogan of, Byzantine politics. Now, as emperor, he was actually a pretty capable ruler. He's best known for really reinforcing Italy for the first time in a couple centuries, really. And he also put down the Paulican Revolt, and this Paulican Revolt was led by a James Bond villain named Chrysocheir, which means golden hand, and he did that in 872. So, again, if you're looking for someone who may be the most interesting of the Byzantine emperors, Basil I has to be at least in your top 5, if not in your top 3. Basil I is a hard act to follow, no matter how you slice it, and his son Leo VI the Wise actually did follow in his father's footsteps and surpass him in most ways that actually matter, even if he wasn't quite as fascinating. Leo was learned on a wide variety of subjects, and he was someone who was one of the better educated of the emperors. So it's kind of interesting that you go from basically a pro wrestler to an intellectual, but, hey, it happens. He also created an updated law code, which was now in Greek rather than Latin, since this was now the language of government in the Byzantine Empire. And this law code would serve as the basis for all subsequent Byzantine law. So anytime there were new laws passed, those laws would be added on to the code compiled by Leo VI. Now, his reputation for wisdom actually grew over time, so after his death he was seen as a prophet, which makes him effectively the Byzantine Nostradamus. Previous emperors had created some waves by marrying more than twice, which was the limit imposed by the church. However, Leo was having trouble conceiving, and it took until his fourth wife until he was able to sire an heir who grew up to become Constantine VII. So that is it for Leo the Wise. But because it took him so long to sire an heir and he didn't live to be old, this means that he left a very young Constantine VII, and he left a state of regency behind. The period of the regency for Constantine VII is normally called the Anatolian Interlude, because during this period, the military aristocracy of Anatolia was largely in control of the affairs of state. The key figure during this period was Romanus I Lecapenus, who ruled from 920 to 944. Leo had actually died in 913, so there were a few previous regents before Romanus I. And he would rule alongside of a young Constantine VII. However, Constantine would come of age in probably about 924 or so, but he wouldn't assume power because Romanus I was holding on to it. And he tried to really prevent Constantine from being a big deal, because what he does is he dilutes the power of the junior emperor by then crowning all 3 or 4 of his own sons as co-emperors. He had his oldest son was pretty competent, and he was looking to pass the empire on to that son. However, when that son died, he looked around at his other 2 or 3 sons, and he said, well, these guys aren't really fit to be emperor, but Constantine VII, you know, he might not be of my line, but he is competent, and I think he'd do a good job. So I think, as a responsible statesman, I need to leave the throne to him. One of Romanus's key achievements was fighting a lot of hard-fought battles in the west against the Bulgars, in which he was mostly successful. Now, after he decided to make Constantine VII his primary heir, his biological sons revolted and deposed Romanus, sent him into exile. But then Constantine VII proved that he was more than just a cipher, and he managed to rally enough public support that the sons of Romanus were also driven off within a couple months, and that left Constantine VII in charge at long last at the age of 39. Constantine VII is a very interesting emperor. He's more famous for the things that he wrote than the things that he did, which seems odd for an actual emperor. And his nickname was Porphyrogenitus, which meant born in the purple. So the main attribute that he had, according to his nickname as ruler, was that he had been born as emperor. So, you know, that's not really that interesting when you think about all of the things that he actually did accomplish and how interesting his life was, since he basically lived as a ward of a would-be usurper for so many years. Now, as I said earlier, he didn't manage to throw off the yoke of Romanus's sons until he was about 39 years old, and that would have been in about 944, 945. But he was officially emperor almost from the time of his birth, around 908. He might have been born a year or so before that, all the way until his death in 959. But the things that he's known for, again, are not things that he did, but things that he wrote. He was a scholar, and he is almost certainly the greatest of the scholar emperors that Byzantium produced. He wrote 3 major works, the best known of which is De Administrando Imperio, which is about the foreign policy of the Byzantine Empire. This is a work which is often translated into English and is something that is considered required reading for any would-be Byzantinist. He also wrote De Thematabus, which is about provincial government, how the themes operate. This is a key source for, you know, how that system worked. And he also wrote another work called De Ceremoniis, which is about imperial ceremony, which had become increasingly complex over time, and, you know, does require some explanation for the uninitiated. Many people think that the later deeds of future emperors like his grandson Basil II owe a lot to the kind of groundwork laid by Constantine VII and the way that he made the job of emperor accessible through these great written works that he left behind. So the father-son relationship between Leo the Wise and Constantine VII makes sense. Both of these guys are scholars. The relationship between Basil I and Leo VI made a little less sense, since we went from a professional wrestler a la Ric Flair to a scholar. And apparently that gene had not died out, though, because basically we're back to a Basil I-esque figure when we get to Romanus II. Now, he is Constantine VII's son and heir, and he ruled for only 4 years until his early death in 963. His main interest in life were seeking pleasure and hunting. And he entrusted state affairs to competent officials, so despite the fact that he actually didn't really do much himself, he did preside over mostly good government. But then when he died and left behind 2 young sons named Basil and Constantine, he left the empire effectively in the hands of his widow Theophano, and it would be her choices as a potential bride which would now shape the future of Byzantium for the next decade or more. So in the time that intervened between the death of Romanus II in 963 and the rise of his son Basil II in 976, we saw two different emperors serving effectively as regents for the Macedonian dynasty. Those two emperors are Nicephorus II Phocas, who ruled from 963 to 969, and John I Tzimiskes, who ruled from 969 to 976. Nicephorus earned quite a cool nickname, the Pale Death of the Saracens. He was a very successful general in the east, as was John, who actually served under Nicephorus II for most of his reign. Both of these men served effectively as representatives of the military aristocracy, so the old Anatolian military aristocracy was back in power, and their main objective was to undermine land laws which protected peasants who owned land, and we'll talk about that more in depth later in this lecture, but this is the main goal of that faction, and Nicephorus and John were both representatives of that faction, and they tried to really weaken the enforcement of laws which protected peasants against predatory practices by elite neighbors. Other than their land policy, they were generally successful militarily, diplomatically, and in all other ways. Empress Theophano actually chose both of these men as husbands. She chose Nicephorus II first because he probably looked like he would have won a civil war, and he was a formidable general. However, apparently she didn't really know him very well personally, because Nicephorus II was notoriously ugly, and he was also someone who didn't really have a very good personality. He was sort of a religious fanatic. He was very, I don't know, he seemed kind of asexual in a sense, like he's very ascetic. So probably not the husband that she wanted. So she conspired with his general John after John had won quite a few battles, and they together launched a coup, killed Nicephorus, and then John took over as emperor. Well, that actually spelled the end for Theophano, because the patriarch said, okay, John can rule as emperor, he's proven himself on the battlefield, but Theophano, you betrayed your own husband, so you gotta go. So Theophano had to retire to a monastery, and John got to be emperor anyway, even after killing, his former patron. So, kind of a gender double standard at play, but hey, I guess the moral of the story is that, if you're ugly and boring, you probably might get betrayed by the opposite sex at some point. I think that's supposed to be the lesson of The Room also, which of course is the greatest philosophical film of our generation. There are quite a number of parallels between the career of Basil II and the career of his grandfather Constantine VII, especially in the early phases of their lives. Now, both of them were crowned at very young ages and then lived under regencies, and then later would have to assume power by forcing out the people who had been serving as their regents. In the case of Basil II, however, he was not a reserved scholarly type, and he was not content to wait until he was nearly 40 years old to take power. So, by the time he came of age at around 16 or 17 in 1076, Basil decided to rule in his own name, and what happened then is that military aristocrats from Anatolia had been so accustomed to ruling over the past 10 years that they refused to accept his claim to sole rule, so he had to fight off a series of rivals for 10 years. Now, during that time, Basil became very battle-hardened and hard-nosed, and after coming out on top from these conflicts by about 985, give or take, Basil's character had been set, and he was now a severe, serious-minded politician and soldier, and he was destined to rule for almost 50 years, all the way up until 1025. And during his time as emperor, he was constantly on campaign and constantly in action doing things for his empire. One of his major policy initiatives was being a champion of peasant landowners against predatory aristocrats. This is something that had been started by his Macedonian dynasty predecessors, but he is the guy who takes it the furthest, and he probably does so in part because he is angry against the Anatolian aristocrats who kept revolting against him for the first 10 years of his reign. So he's a huge champion of peasant landowners, and under him the thematic system will reach its absolute peak. But what he's most known for are his actual wars against the foreign enemies of Byzantium. Basil II ruled for a long time and presided over a lot of important events and developments in Byzantine history. One of his most enduring achievements was the formation of the Varangian Guard, where the empire began to rely on Viking mercenaries in the ranks, and to use these both as the emperor's personal guard and occasionally as shock troops in pitched battles. But the way that he earned his nickname, the Bulgar-Slayer, was by, as you may have guessed, slaying Bulgars. So, while Basil was busy fighting off the pretenders from the Anatolian military aristocracy, someone named Samuel had revived the Bulgar state in the Balkans and was challenging Byzantine supremacy there. So what Basil did is, rather than defending Byzantine land first, he attacked the Bulgar homelands across the Danube first, then struck south against the Bulgar field armies. And this strategy was mostly successful. The Bulgars were being greatly reduced. Basil had at various times to leave and go east to deal with stuff there, but he spent most of his career fighting the Bulgars. Now, after he had them nearly beat, the Bulgar leadership decided to risk a pitched battle and try to reverse their fortunes, so they met Basil at the Battle of Kilidian in 1014. And in that battle, Basil was completely victorious, and he managed to capture about 14,000 or so Bulgars. Now, King Samuel himself managed to escape home. So what Basil did is he divided the captured men into groups of 100, and of those 100, one man was chosen to have just one of his eyes put out, whereas the other 99 were completely blinded. And then these one-eyed men served as guides to lead all of these now disabled veterans home. So when Samuel saw all of these disabled men coming back home with their eyes, put out, he had a stroke and died. And that is how you earn a moniker the medieval way. While this judgment is not quite universal, most Byzantinists feel that the end of the reign of Basil II, the Bulgar-Slayer, was the apogee of the Byzantine Empire in terms of its ability to maintain its territorial integrity and defend itself. Now, this empire was nowhere near as big as the empire that Justinian built, but it was much more stable. Every frontier was well defended, the armies were all in great shape, the leadership, both civilly and militarily, was mostly competent. You had a strong emperor at Constantinople directing affairs, economic prosperity was increasing, peasant landowners were secure, aristocratic ambition was being kept in check, everything, in other words, was good. And because the army was so feared after all the things that it had accomplished under Basil, most foreign opponents didn't really have much interest in messing with the Byzantines. And after Basil, even if before the Macedonian dynasty had already been about as legitimate as any dynasty could be, now its legitimacy went without question. Basil II was a transformational figure, and he was the kind of guy who was a legend in his own lifetime. However, there were problems ahead, and Basil's achievements would be the only reason why Byzantium was able to stumble through decades and decades and decades of incompetent leadership. It's really hard to point to anything that Basil II did that left the empire weaker than how he found it. His one major mistake in life was that he became such a serious-minded soldier that he never took the time to marry and sire offspring who could carry on his empire. Instead, he left that duty to his co-emperor Constantine VIII, who mostly was hanging out in Constantinople. Constantine VIII did have children, but both of them were daughters. Or maybe he had 3 daughters, I don't remember, 2 or 3. And the problem is, none of these daughters ended up having children of their own for various reasons. So what happens is, after Constantine dies in 1028, his daughters then get to select husbands who become emperor. His daughters are not immortal, they're also fairly old. Remember, Basil lived for quite a long time. And after those daughters are dead, there's really no one left who can pass on the legitimacy of the Macedonian dynasty. So that in itself is a major problem, not to mention that the emperors after Constantine VIII are basically ciphers for various factions within the state, including the military aristocracy. So now let's talk about the various factors which had Byzantium on a downward spiral over the course of the 11th century following Basil's death. Let's take a break from the march of events to kind of look at some of the underlying factors which led to the deterioration of the Byzantine state after Basil II. So the Macedonian dynasty had always taken measures that would protect peasants from rich neighbors. These measures, as I mentioned earlier, peak under Basil II. And the way that these work is if a peasant becomes poor and needs to get rid of his land in order to pay his debts or what have you, there are a lot of rules in place which means that this land will go to some relative or another peasant before an aristocratic landowner will have time to bid on it. The goal of the Dynatoi, which is the new name for the large, powerful landowners, Dynatoi literally means the powerful in Greek, their objective is to make the land bidding open to all bidders, which means that the rich neighbors will have an advantage because they can outbid poorer relatives. So what this means is that in times when their policies are prevalent, we see that a lot of peasant landowners are forced off their land and large estates build up increasingly. Now, this is also combined with the fact that, like all rich people throughout time, the Dynatoi don't want to pay taxes. And because they're powerful in society, they pull strings and do things to avoid paying taxes. When rich people don't pay taxes, the state can't really function too well, because especially when rich people are becoming richer and they're driving peasants off the land, so that way peasants are now no longer able to pay taxes. So it becomes a vicious cycle, and this really impoverishes the state as a whole. So another consequence is that under the thematic system, a lot of peasants had been expected to hold enough land, or at least soldiers held enough land that would enable them to afford military equipment. And some of the emperors had increased the amount that a soldier needed as equipment became more sophisticated and heavy. However, because the Dynatoi are gobbling up all of the land that could be used to sustain soldiers, this will lead from a transition from the thematic system to what is known as the Pronoia System. And I'll talk about the Pronoia System shortly. Byzantium post-1025 seems to have been divided politically between the military aristocrats who lived in rural areas and the civil aristocrats who worked in the bureaucracy at Constantinople itself. Now, the goal of the military aristocrats mostly was to spend what money that they had on the military and to pursue land policies which favored the Dynatoi over the peasants. And most of these people, because they were large landowners who were reliable for a lot of taxes, wanted to find ways to get out of those taxes. And they had all kinds of ideas about how to do that. A lot of times it involved just not paying. Civil aristocrats, they, as I said, worked in the capital, and they wanted to strengthen the central state. They wanted to spend money beautifying and fortifying the capital, developing the harbors, all that kind of stuff. And they also wanted to strengthen the bureaucracy, which is what they led. It kind of makes sense. They are part of the bureaucracy. They want to make it stronger, give it more power, which gives them more power. The military guys, work with the army a lot, so they want to strengthen that. It's very much a case of, people promoting what they're a part of without really any regard for what is best overall. Just what is their only concern really is what is best for them personally. Now, the civil aristocrats, because they are not the large landowners out in the provinces, tend to favor Macedonian-era laws protecting peasant landowners, and then they also obviously want provincial aristocrats to pay taxes, because unless those guys pay taxes, it's hard to really run a bureaucracy. And the strength of the civil aristocrats will mean that even in periods when the military aristocrats are in the ascendant, the civil aristocrats still prevent the laws protecting peasants from being repealed. What they can't do, however, is make sure those laws get enforced. So those laws never quite go away. They just cease to be enforced. And that is what I mean when I say that the military aristocracy comes to power and really wins out on the land law issue. So what is the Pronoia System? Well, As the thematic system is declining across the course of the 11th century, as the military aristocracy gets its way and estates become more and more consolidated in the hands of the rich, what we see is the rise of what becomes known as the Pronoia System. The word pronoia in Greek means gift or grant, and the people who receive it are called pronoiars. So what this is we have the imperial government using what is known as tax farming and privatization. Tax farming is the practice whereby someone rich will pay the government a set fee, and that is a fee which represents the amount of taxes that one could reasonably expect to raise from an area. And then they buy the right to go and collect those taxes and then keep them. Any profit which goes above what that person paid to get the contract, they can keep. The problem is when you hire tax farmers, you have to make those contracts appealing. So you have to, pay bidders who aren't bidding very high. So the government does get money reliably at the beginning of the year. However, this money will then not be as much as they could have collected through normal tax collection. And a lot of times this Pronoia system will be compared to feudalism. However, that comparison doesn't hold up. Now, it is similar in the sense that this is a system which is fundamentally about rich landowners doing what they want and trampling everyone else, and it's a system which promotes and celebrates the growth of inequality. However, the real difference, though, is that this land, while it is being privatized and it is being, the power to exercise this land is being divvied out among private entities, the state itself still technically does own the land and has the right to revoke these contracts to tax farmers and to the large landowners. Another major difference is that because the Byzantine Empire is not subject to Germanic inheritance law, these estates are not divisible, and a large part of the reason why these estates aren't divisible is because some of these estates are designed to support soldiers, and soldiers, as we talked about, need a certain income to have enough money to buy and repair things like war horses and military equipment. Partly, some people think that this Pronoia system was fueled in part by the increasing weight and cost of arms and armor as the Western influence really increases and Byzantine troops become heavier, because the heavier the armor is, the more money it costs. So some people think that maybe this was part of the motive for the military aristocrats. They want to make sure that their men have a sufficient amount of money, so they want these estates to consolidate so that they will produce enough revenue to sustain a heavy armored man. But anyway, this is more or less what the Pronoia system looks like, and as this system comes into play, this will undermine the previous thematic system. And another long-term consequence is that the office of strategos will go away, as it no longer is necessary, and we'll see that governors become civilian more or less once again, and a lot of these large landowners will become generals who are a little less officially empowered and a little bit less beholden to the imperial government at Constantinople as well. The triumph of the preferred policies of the military aristocrats will have a big impact on Byzantine finance. Byzantium will still have the same expenses to meet, but they'll have less revenue with which to do it. So one way to make up for that in the short run, or maybe even in the intermediate run, is to take this now diminished pile of money and then use your precious metals more sparingly in your coins, print more of those coins, and meet your expenses that way. And this process will start with Constantine IX, who ruled from 1042 to 1055. And his devaluing of the Solidus, which had been an internationally acclaimed coin for 700 years, was the first time since Constantine initiated the use of the Solidus that this coin had been significantly devalued. And after Constantine IX, emperors after him devalued it pretty heavily. I believe it went from, I don't want to give numbers because I can't remember them right offhand, but the rate of decline is pretty steep. Now, the immediate impact is unknown. A lot of people talk about inflation in the ancient world, but they forget that there were no actual economists in antiquity, and there was no like CSNBC or something like that which could announce to people what the rate of inflation was. So it's really unclear exactly how inflation would have worked, or if it would have worked the same way as it does in the modern world. But we do know that people did notice that these coins were not as full of precious metals they had been, and the Byzantine coinage becomes a lot less standard for international trade. And in time, this will also serve to really damage the business of Byzantine merchants. Up until this point in the Middle Ages, the Byzantines in the East and the Western Europeans considered themselves to be members of the same church, even if they were from quite different branches of it. The Pope in Rome was still the titular head of all Christians, at least all Orthodox Christians, and in theory the Patriarch was his subordinate, even if things actually worked a little differently in practice due to the prestige of the Emperor in Constantinople. Well, 1054 would change all that, and what we basically have are three men with massive egos who fight over authority when it comes to their place in the church. Those men are Pope Leo IX and Cardinal Humbert from the Catholic Church in Rome, who claim that the Catholic Pope has the ability to do whatever he wants and make appointments in the East. And then the Patriarch of Constantinople, who naturally has a different view. His name is Michael Cyrillarius. So what happens is Cardinal Humbert visits as an envoy. He meets with the Patriarch. They get into a falling out, and then Humbert declares the Byzantines excommunicated and the Patriarch deposed and all of that stuff. So what the Patriarch does is he then goes to Constantine IX and has him condemn the Roman Catholic practices, including the use of Latin and Mass and all that kind of stuff, and then they in turn excommunicate the papal delegation. So this is the official schism of 1054, and this is why there is a Roman Catholic Church and an Eastern Orthodox Church, and they have some differences, but they're more or less the same. Now, the actual differences in this dispute were pretty minimal, and most of them were fairly superficial things, like what language you conduct Mass in, and just kind of this little nitty-gritty stuff we've been talking about when it comes to religion and inter-Christian debates. And whatever, all those differences, like I said, they're minimal, but for people at the time, these differences were very meaningful, and these differences will lead to very hard feelings, misunderstanding, and bloodshed. We'll see that this schism also leads to enough distrust that it is possibly responsible for the lack of communication and cooperation between the Byzantines and the Crusaders about 40 years after this. So Basil II died in 1025, and then his brother Constantine VIII took over. He died in 1028. He only had daughters, and they never had any offspring of their own. So their husbands were emperor, but eventually both of these daughters are dead. The last of them died in 1050, and she was married to Constantine IX. After that, some more people are emperor, and then in 1068, there's another period where you have an emperor dying young and leaving behind a widow and some children. So we have another widowed empress, Eudokia, and she decides to marry the general Romanus Diogenes in order to protect the future of her young sons. Now, interestingly enough, after the death of Basil, the dominant faction in the Byzantine state were actually the civil aristocrats, but they were forced to make major policy concessions to the military aristocrats in terms of land policy and stuff like that. Romanus IV, as he becomes known, gathers a major army early in his reign, and he decides that the task that he needs to do is to drive out a group called the Seljuk Turks from Anatolia. They have taken quite a bit of land there, and they look like a major threat. Now at this time, as you already know from my lecture on the state of the Abbasid Caliphate, the Seljuks were in the ascendancy throughout the Islamic world, and they posed a legitimate threat to all of their neighbors. So Romanus spent a lot of money hiring many mercenaries, and he raised an army of about 50 to 70,000 men, and he launched an all-out campaign. So he decided first to strike in the east, which would have been beyond the frontier of Byzantium, and while he's there, the Seljuks simply avoid him and then go to the center of Anatolia and capture cities that were in Byzantine hands. Now, eventually these two forces will collide at a place called Manzikert, and there both sides are eager and willing to fight a pitched battle. Obviously, Romanus IV has a large army that he's eager to use, and the Seljuks have been mostly victorious for years at this point, and they feel very confident in their fighting abilities. What happens? So in a previous lecture on the Normans, I mentioned that the Normans had booted the Byzantines from South Italy at some point. Well, that wound still festered some, but not enough to prevent the Normans from sometimes serving as mercenaries when the Byzantines were offering pay. So Romanus had actually hired a considerable number of Norman mercenaries, and they were holding one of the flanks of his army. And you know, the Normans are great soldiers, so that seemed like a pretty cool idea. But what happens is on day one of the battle, the Normans decided to turn and flee, and that left the Byzantines exposed. They managed to survive that day. I'm not really sure if this was betrayal because they were bought off by the Seljuks, or whether they just didn't care enough to risk their lives on the behalf of the Byzantines. I don't know exactly what happened. The implication seems to be that there was betrayal. Anyway, part of that is just the Byzantine very heavy bias against the Normans. Anyway, so day two comes along, and apparently the departure of the Normans wasn't fatal. Remember, Romanus had a huge army, so losing part of it was not necessarily fatal. And on day two, Romanus is pressing hard in the center, and it looks like he's on the cusp of victory. But then he has an imperial would-be rival named Andronicus Ducas, and Ducas decides that he needs to get rid of Romanus by delegitimizing him. So he spreads a rumor that Romanus had fallen in battle, and this causes a panic to spread throughout the Byzantine army. The entire army is routed, and because the Seljuks have a lot of mounted archers and a lot of mobility, they are then able to inflict a fairly heavy toll and make this a decisive victory. And at the end, Romanus IV is captured in battle. So what was, so basically now that the Macedonian dynasty is gone, no one really respects the emperor all that much, and people are willing to do some fairly despicable things in order to advance their own candidacy for the throne, even if it means undermining the empire itself. So I really want to be clear about the scale of the disaster at Manzikert. It was a bad defeat, and the Byzantines certainly lost quite a number of men. However, most of the men who fought in the battle did survive, and this should not have really been a major game changer in the long run. Now, it was a pretty bad beating, and it probably should have hurt Romanus's reputation and confidence, but again, not necessarily fatal and not irrecoverable by any stretch of the imagination. So Romanus was fairly quickly released, and the only concession that he had to make to the Seljuks was ceding his right to Armenia. So again, he was still left with the heartland of his empire, and should have been able to recover. Had he been more legitimate going into this, he undoubtedly would have managed to hold on to his frontier. However, as soon as he's captured and his legitimacy is destroyed by this defeat, generals in Anatolia begin to leave their post and go to the capital to fight for the throne. And what happens is now we have a series of civil wars which will last an entire decade. And over the course of that decade, what we see is that Anatolia will be undefended, and the Seljuks will simply conquer the land almost without any real fight. So 1071 to 1081 is a series of, it's basically just the Seljuks march in, take over, and Byzantine heartland is lost. So the real tragedy of Manzikert is not the battle itself, it is this power struggle that ensues after it, where the Byzantines end up destroying all their armies, rather than sending them to defend their land against the encroaching Seljuks. From 1071 to 1081, the Byzantines had two different emperors, both of whom were almost entirely ineffective. The last of these two guys was then overthrown by a military aristocrat named Alexius I Comnenus. He was actually related to a short-lived emperor from about 20 or 30 years before, and he will come to power in 1081 and rule all the way until 1118, and his dynasty, the Komnenoi, will last for 5 generations on the throne of Byzantium. He is from one of the great military aristocratic houses, and he and his family will represent the interest of the military aristocracy as a whole, and he will have intermarriages with 4 or so of the other most important families who represent that group. Now, Alexius, therefore, as you might guess, is no friend of the peasant, but he is a great friend of the Byzantine soldier. In 1081, Robert Guiscard captures Dyrrhachium, which is on the coast of the Byzantine Balkans in the west, and he manages to raid as far as Larissa. Now, interestingly enough, the reason why Robert attacks is because the guy who Alexius deposes was married into the same family as Robert, so Robert was claiming to avenge a relative. Again, dynastic politics involve you in a lot of weird stuff, so Alexius has to deal with that. And it's a crisis. Again, the entire East at this point is basically lost, and the Balkans are now being attacked, so he doesn't have very many resources to draw on. So to raise money, he has to actually sell off church treasures and hire mercenaries. His other move is one that would prove fatal for his successors, but in the short term made a lot of sense, and that was to ally himself with the Venetians. Venice was a relatively new city-state in Italy, and they had one thing that the Byzantines no longer had, and that is a navy. The thing about navies is that they're very expensive to maintain, and the Byzantines have been strapped for cash for a while, so their navy is rotted away. So the Venetians are able to provide this navy and deal with the threat from the Normans. However, in exchange, what the Venetians get is a free trade agreement where their merchants can work anywhere in Byzantine territory without having to pay taxes. And what that leads to is the domination of the Byzantine economy and trade network by Venetians, and this means that Byzantine merchants will quickly become ruined and will never make a comeback. From now until the end of the Byzantine Empire, Venetians and other Italians will be the dominant commercial force in Byzantine territory. Even after allying with the Venetians, Alexius still had a lot of challenges coming from the west. Now, the Norman threat would be lifted in 1085 when Robert Guiscard would die and the Normans would leave the Balkans, but there were other challenges at hand. In 1090, there was a siege of Constantinople by the Patzinaks, and Alexius was only able to survive that because he got the Cumans to arrive and relieve the siege on his behalf in 1091. And after that, he takes his army to Serbia, and he is trying to restore dominance in the Balkans as a whole, but there's a Cuman revolt, and he's unable to quite restore the Balkans to what they had been under Basil II, although the Byzantines are still pretty strong in the Balkans. And now he's starting to look at his east, where things are still pretty damn bad, but there are problems among the Seljuks, and it looks like he might have an opening. So now that his home base in the Balkans is relatively secure and stable, maybe not quite perfect, but pretty good, Alexius looks across the straits at Anatolia and realizes that his Seljuk opponents have divided amongst themselves and that they are now politically splintered. This means that if he can raise a decent army, he actually has a legitimate chance of reuniting most of this land under Byzantine control. And since this is the Byzantine heartland, and most likely the homeland for his family, this is something that it very much appeals to him. The problem is Alexius will need new allies, or at least more troops, to accomplish this. Without Anatolia, his normal recruiting grounds are somewhat limited. So once again, he decides to tap into the Western manpower pools. However, he really doesn't understand what he's asking for. He doesn't understand this new crusading ideal. He doesn't understand the Pope's ambition. And he really just thinks that they will be willing to play along on his terms. Also keep in mind that the full implications of his deal with the Venetians have by no means made themselves felt as of yet. The things I talked about above are the long-term consequences of that agreement. So the Crusaders want to come and kill a bunch of Muslims and then take over what they consider to be the Holy Land. The Byzantines, while they would tell you that they fight for Christ, their idea is a little more mundane. They want to defend what they see as their lands. They want to retake things that they've held within living memory. Things like Nicaea, Nicomedia, Ephesus, things like that. They're not really all that interested in Jerusalem. Whereas the Crusaders, their ultimate goal is to go to Jerusalem. And Pope Urban II is the best example of a trend that is prevalent among pretty much every ambitious pope of the Middle Ages, and that is that the Pope wants to extend the power of the papacy, and anytime someone asks for the Pope's help, the Pope will then invent a new power for himself, or anything that he accomplishes he will then try to claim as a precedent that everyone in the future will have to respect. And now the Pope will claim the ability to declare war, and to declare whether wars are holy or not, and whether wars are legitimate or not. And now that the Pope and the Emperor are officially in different, albeit closely related religions, this is not a precedent which bodes well for the Byzantines going forward. So Alexius's failure to understand the Crusaders and the Crusaders' failure to understand him will lead to a lot of problems, and we'll talk about those problems when we talk about the First Crusade in my very next video.